To begin this video presentation, I would like to start by explaining the purpose of this video and supplemental materials. When a loved one dies, we all grieve their passing, and this includes children. As educators, we are all often faced with supporting students through a process that is extremely personal and complex. Not to mention, grief and death are difficult enough subjects to discuss with adults, and even more so with children. The goal of this video is to inform about the process of grief in children, and then to provide methods of supporting and talking about death and grief with students. We will start off by discussing common grief reactions in children. In the years of elementary school, there tends to be two basic categories of grief reaction in regards to developmental stages. The first tends to span the years between kindergarten and the second grade. During this time, children have an increased ability to understand the finality of death, as opposed to when they were in preschool. This likelihood for understanding grows with a child, meaning that you may have students in kindergarten who still don't quite grasp the full concept of what death is, but by the second grade, the vast majority will. While children may understand better the nature of death and have those logical immediate responses like sadness or crying, those initial responses tend to be briefer than you would see in adults. However, children in these ages tend to manifest a lot of their grief in more somatic, physical, or behavioral symptoms. So this can mean anything from stomach aches, headaches, being very tired, sleeping in class, to yelling or snapping at their peers, or so on and so forth. Another hallmark of grieving in this age group is magical thinking. While children are in the pre-operational stage of development, their logical thinking is still in the process of developing, and so they might develop ideas that they are to blame for the death, or that wishing really hard can bring back their loved one. This magical thinking can lead to a lot of anxiety. Children may develop fears that living loved ones may soon pass away as well. They might worry that they will die too, and so on and so forth. As children age and their language develops, it becomes easier to talk with them about these concerns and correct those unhealthy thinking patterns. As students age into upper elementary levels, they become more concerned with understanding factual information about the death. So they might ask more questions about the specific how and the manner that their loved one dies. And this is an effort to gain control over the situation by understanding it better. In this light, children at these ages might become so invested in the facts that they avoid emotional expression. And because of this, it might be difficult to generate discussions on feelings for those children, and for those children to engage in more emotional situations because they're trying so hard to avoid dealing with the deeper emotions that come with age and grief. These emotional avoidances can lead to a demeanor that is rather brief and passive when they're talking about grief. An example might be a nonchalant mention of a feeling sad and missing their loved one before just moving on to another subject. Emotional avoidance doesn't mean that the emotions surrounding grief are non-existent. And because of this, emotional avoidance might mean that those very strong feelings come out sideways in the anger of aggression, in anger and defiance. And this sort of reaction may also come into play with elementary students who are older developmentally, because that is another key hallmark of the next stage of grief development. Next, I'm going to show you a quick video clip from a doctor of palliative medicine at Mercy Clinic in Missouri. And this doctor has a lot of great information to share with you about childhood grief and how it's affected by developmental stages.
Children, sometimes people feel like they can't don't grieve in the same way that adults do. And it's true that there are some differences, but they feel a loss the same way that anyone does. It's just different for each developmental age. So an infant who has a sibling or a parent who dies would feel that as a loss of self, of separation, because until you're about 18 months old, really the whole world is kind of you. So it's a different sense of loss. But just because you had that loss in an infant doesn't mean that you wouldn't then go on and grieve the same way when you got to the next developmental age. So an infant who never knew her mother, for instance, when she was an infant, of course wouldn't grieve in the same way that the husband might have grieved. But when that child grows up and is getting married for herself the first time and feels that loss of her mother, she will go through those same symptoms of grief and loss then that another adult might have. So one of the important things to realize about children is that their grief is not just a one-time thing, that as they progress through the different stages of development, they will re-grieve a loss. And so you might see these symptoms of grief coming and going. And you have to, I think one of the important things for parents to understand is to be prepared for that and to know that that's going to happen and that it's normal and it's okay.
One important concept to remember is that no two individuals, adult or child, grieve the same. Everyone has an individual process, and that process asks those who support them to learn, understand, and support that individual's particular way of grieving. Grief can also be affected by a variety of factors. Things like personality, closeness to the deceased, time since the death, and experience with death can work to determine how severe a grief response is. When trauma enters the picture of grief, for instance, if the death is especially sudden or violent, grief can become further complicated with issues such as post-traumatic stress disorder. In cases like these, it is especially important to make sure you reach out to your student support team. The home environment can also have a huge impact on how a student may grieve. If your student is living in a home where the caregivers are also grieving and they may have a variety of other stressors, it's understandable that they struggle to provide attention and support. At the same time, if a household is able to be very supportive, they are empathetic, and they encourage a lot of personal thoughts and feelings and sharing of personal stories, that can help a child grieve a great deal. Culture can also impact how grieving is expressed. There are countless cultures and subcultures that have different traditions and expectations when it comes to dealing with the death of a loved one. For all of these, it is beneficial to understand the circumstances of students in order to provide more individualized support. When you talk about loss with your student, it's normal to be unsure of what to say or how to say it. It might be helpful to talk to the caregivers or parents of your student to learn about what they have shared with their child and the terms they use to describe the situations they've encountered. As you talk with your grieving student, I would encourage you to avoid euphemisms to describe what's happened. It's really easy to confuse younger children with phrases like, they went to a better place, or they went to sleep, or they're going away for a long time. This might cause them to believe that the deceased will come back, or that if they go to sleep, they won't wake up. Stick to factual phrases like, their heart stopped working, and they won't be able to walk or talk again, and it means they're not alive anymore. When you do talk to a student, ask if they have questions and do your best to answer them. If you aren't sure, it's really okay to tell a student just that. In the subject of questions, remember that it is normal for children to ask a lot of questions about new things they encounter. While this might mean you have a lot of questions to answer, remember that it is developmentally appropriate, even if it is a little uncomfortable. Encourage expression. Encourage your student to talk about good memories or to share how they are feeling at different times. This helps to create an environment and a relationship where a student feels safe talking. Lastly, remember to just listen and reassure your student that you are there for them. You won't always have the answers, but sometimes the act of listening can be of a great comfort. Some other ways you can support your student is to do 1. Check-ins periodically. Ask a student at different times during the day or during the week how they're feeling and what they might need if they are struggling. As a teacher, you are certainly busy with other important tasks, but a quick 1 to 2 minute conversation can do a lot to show that you care and to address potential issues as they come up. When a student does share a feeling, it's best not to immediately try to cheer them up or immediately turn them back to whatever task was going on at the time. Sometimes listening and saying that their feeling is normal, and adults feel that way too sometimes, is a great way to show that you won't dismiss their feelings and also to get them back to work in a more productive way. And often that approach does a lot to help a child feel better on its own. Teaching coping skills is another way to help students manage their emotions in settings where they do have important work to do. If you use the process of listening, acknowledging the feeling, and then tell them that sometimes sharing a happy memory helps you get through the day, or sometimes taking a deep breath or getting a drink of water is a great way to reset yourself so that you can get back to the things that you need to do during the school day. When you provide coping skills, it tells the student that their feelings are okay and natural, while also helping your students learn tools to manage the big feelings that they'll have throughout life. Operate with empathy. When you are engaged in your teaching routine, you may notice behaviors that either disrupt the classroom or individual students' learning. In these cases, before you act, just be aware of what might be going on. Address the issue by asking what the student is thinking or feeling, and then work together to problem solve the issue. Lastly, reach out for support. Your school counselor, school psychologist, and school social worker, along with anyone else on the student support team, are there to help you with addressing potential issues. They're also there if you're feeling overwhelmed and unsure. Before I conclude this presentation, I just want to provide a couple of websites with some really helpful sources for teachers concerning grieving students. The first is a link to the National Association of School Psychologists website. If you go on their website and search grief in their search bar, you'll find a lot of detailed information on childhood grief and some other resources that you might be able to use in your classroom. The second is the Children in Grief page for the Scholastic website. And this has a lot of the same type of information, but it's more directed at elementary teachers and it has a lot more focus on resources to use in the classroom. And lastly, I'm just going to send another plug for your student support team. They're there to help you, they're there to support you. Reach out to them whenever you feel the need. And in conclusion, I just want to thank you so much for watching this video presentation and for your interest in grief support. If you have any comments, questions, or concerns, please feel free to leave a comment in the comment section, and I'll be more than happy to get back to you to answer any of your questions or just to have a conversation about childhood grief and what we as school support staff and teachers can do to better support our students.